Good morning, afternoon, or evening. This video is meant to give an introductory description of some of the communication standards and qualities that make up the academia, or for better terms, academic writing, of the writing and rhetoric studies academic discourse community. To set the stage, I'll first briefly explain what it means for something to be a part of the writing and rhetoric studies academic discourse. And to start, we need to define what a discourse community actually is. James Gee has described discourse on its own as connected stretches of language that make sense. To use it in our context and in the context of a discourse community, the stretches of language need to make sense to a certain group of people or a certain community of people. A discourse community could simply be a group of people who communicate in a specific way that each person is able to understand, but it goes a bit further than that. Discourse communities, especially academic or professional ones, share common beliefs, values, and goals, and they make sure that communication within the community is consistent so that all members are able to understand and interpret it. To use an example, if I were to talk about a community of trail runners, we can dissect their discourse community by paying attention to some different things like their values, their goals, and the vocabulary that they use. Sometimes that vocabulary isn't going to be something you know unless you are a trail runner, and they follow certain conventions or unwritten rules in how they communicate and interact with each other. All of this accumulates to what can be considered their discourse community. Scholars in the discourse community of writing and rhetoric studies focus on written communication and the study of rhetoric. Rhetoric is simply the use of language forms such as writing, speech, or visual imagery in order to influence an audience. This discourse community is very broad in terms of topical focus, but the scholars in the community all focus on how writing is conducted and an analysis of how rhetoric was, is, or could be used. Scholars share their information and findings with peers and all other members of the community by publishing their work, whether through academic journals, online, or through presentations. This presentation is specifically focused on how writers and scholars in the writing and rhetoric studies discourse community communicate through written publications in academic journals. Since I'm focusing on the written communication of scholars in the discourse community, I'd like to briefly mention how this communication is distributed and regulated. Often the most credible and acknowledged way to share your writing in this community is by trying to get published in one or more of the many academic journals whose specific purpose is to propagate information that is insightful and beneficial to the academic community overall. On the left of the slide, I've included a snip from Stony Brook University's website that provides simple links to some of the prominent journals for writing and rhetoric studies. As you can see, they're all titled in a way that describes either the journal's purpose or focus for the things they publish. For the remainder of this presentation, I've used a few sample papers that I've pulled from the journals of College Composition and Communication, Rhetorica, a journal of history and rhetoric, and written communication in order to show the similarities and conventions that are used in published articles. Now I will be moving on to how scholars share their information through published articles, and I'm going to begin by going over some structural components of the articles before progressing to some interesting uses of rhetorical strategy that you will find in articles from this discourse community. The majority of articles that are published within the community have the structure shown in the slide, often in the order that it is listed. Sometimes there will be variations of the structure depending on which journal is publishing the article, but for the most part, the articles will abide by this structural progression. Below the author's name and the paper's title, the first section that will be found is the abstract. This abstract is usually a smaller font and clearly segmented from the rest of the paper by either indenting the whole thing or using horizontal lines at the top and bottom, as you can see in the snippet on the left of this slide. The abstract is where the author will summarize their whole paper in an explicit manner, explaining the article without the fluff, information, and descriptions provided in the actual article. Sometimes you'll find that you do not understand all of the vocabulary or statements made in the abstract because the explanation is either described in the article or is knowledge that the author assumes the reader is already going to understand going into the article. Use this section to get an idea of what the article is about before you read the whole thing, and don't be afraid to look up terms you don't understand. Sometimes this will help you comprehend the rest of the article should you continue. Following the abstract, and often not explicitly identified as the introduction section, it is customary to begin the introduction with a dropped cap, which is the large first letter you can see in the example on the right side of this slide. The dropped cap is dependent on the publication, which most journals follow the convention. Regardless, the section immediately following the abstract is assumed to be the introduction, where the author will place the purpose of their article, as well as provide the context why their purpose is relevant. Sometimes, if there's a large amount of information necessary to know or to understand in order to place the article in context, the author will follow the introduction section with a section dedicated to background information. Otherwise, it will always be included in the introduction. After the introduction and background, the meat and potatoes of the article begin to appear. The authors construct their argument by utilizing subsections to describe or expand upon certain points. Each of the subsection headings is usually titled in a way to cue the reader onto a certain topic. In the example on the left of the slide, the title, Assault on Education, tells the reader what the following section will be focused on as a component of their overall argument. These sections all combine to be the descriptive argument or presentation of information that the author is using to support their purpose. To finish out the substantive portion of the article, authors will conclude with a final thought, or sometimes even a titled conclusion section, in order to bring the reader back to the purpose of the article and relate how all of the information provided combines to support their purpose. This section usually varies in length, but it always contains a summary restatement of their introductory claim in relation to their provided evidence. Often in this section, authors will show their personal beliefs and how they interpret the information to support their purpose. These final thoughts will usually be followed by notes and reference sections, and they usually vary in formatting and location from one journal to another. For notes, superscript numbers are distributed throughout the article, and they correspond with the numbered note in the notes section. Usually this is provided just before the reference section, as shown in the top left of this slide, or provided at the bottom of the same page, as shown in the bottom left example. Notes are provided to include information that is not directly relevant to the context of the writing where the note is placed. And notes can contain a variety of information, such as a description or a direction for further reading. But if the note is placed directly in the text, it would either be distracting or out of context. For the majority of writing and rhetoric studies journals, the final section will be the reference section. This is where all the cited information is compiled so that the reader can know where the information came from, as well as prove that they didn't just make up everything you just read. This is a key component of the author's appeal to ethos, which is something we will touch on shortly. I'll now move on to discuss some of the common strategies used by authors in this discourse community to solidify their arguments. The term rhetorical strategies is very broad, and there are a lot of different strategies that get employed by authors depending on their article type and purpose. But common in all academic writing is the necessity to abide by three appeals that comprise a good argument. There's also a fourth component to having a good argument, which is having applicable timing and context. However, I will not be discussing that in this presentation. Before discussing the appeals for this discourse community, I'd like to provide a brief reminder of what the appeals are and how they affect the overall argument. Starting out, we have ethos, which is the appeal to authority, or as I like to think, the credibility of the author has to make their argument. The appeal to ethos must prove that the author is in a sound position to be making the argument, not just making things up or not established in the community. Some of this comes from the author's position or education, but a lot of the appeal to ethos comes from providing solid, relevant, and cited information to back up the claims being made in the article. Then we have logos. This is an appeal to logical reasoning, where the author must construct a sound argument. Does the author follow formal logic? Do they make any logical fallacies? And are their claims sufficiently addressed and supported in the article? Finally, we have the appeal to pathos. To appeal to pathos is to actually sway your reader, to connect to them emotionally. An author who effectively appeals to pathos will connect to their readers and open up a pathway to persuasion. Through this appeal, the author makes an engaging and meaningful argument that makes the reader feel involved with the topic. Sufficiently appealing to all three of these will make for an overall effective argument. Appealing to logos is something of a necessity for all academic writing. Any argument or purpose of writing must be of sound logical reasoning and be consistent with established information. It is the author's duty to present this to the reader, which requires the ability to write and present information effectively and in the correct context. Each of the claims made within an article must adequately support the overall purpose, and the author needs to avoid fallacies and flaws through that process. The Writing and Rhetoric Studies academic discourse community is mostly comprised of career writers, so the appeal to logos is somewhat given for most work that is created. The structure of the articles, which I've discussed earlier, helps the authors in appealing to logos by helping the reader comprehend and parse the author's purpose and points. Pretty much all journal-published articles will have a decently effective appeal to both ethos and pathos along with their appeal to logos, because many of them would not have a strong argument. But the approach to these appeals is something that I can discuss minor specifics of as they relate specifically to the study of writing and rhetoric. Starting with ethos, scholars combine their baseline credibility with the information they present in order to make this appeal. Their baseline credibility can be observed by their presence within the community, oftentimes shown through the author bio that's included somewhere in the article, or in the journal, or the credibility of the journal overall. Being published in a peer-reviewed journal is a significant boost of credibility on its own, because it means that other members of the community have verified their work. Presentation of information in writing and rhetoric studies is heavily dependent on the use of established information with correct citations. In some cases, such as with Miller et al., a research study is conducted where the authors need to present how they conducted the study in order to be examined for flaws. In the majority of articles, however, scholars in this field are not conducting experimental studies and are rather making claims based upon information and sources that have already been established. In this scenario, the author must be diligent in citing their information and selecting their sources so that their argument holds credibility. In the snippet at the bottom of this slide, I've shown a section from Kirby's article that shows where and how they got the information that was used in the construction of their argument. Moving on to pathos, writing and rhetoric academia has a specific benefit when it comes to making this appeal. All members of this discourse community, as well as anyone breaching into the community, have a shared experience of needing and knowing about writing. This allows for authors to make a quick connection with the audience because their work typically applies to each reader. Using Miller et al. As an example again, they conducted research on the emotional component of reflective writing, something that maybe isn't explicitly acknowledged by readers, but is nonetheless almost a guaranteed shared experience for any scholar who is reading the article. The three example articles I've used for this presentation all seem to have exploited this inherent connection to writing in some way for the reader to relate the claim that the author is making to the reader's personal experiences. In turn, the reader becomes more attached and perceptive to what they are reading, and the argument becomes more effective. Combining everything together, the structural conventions and effective argumentation allows for an easy distribution of credible information through the writing and rhetoric studies academic discourse. There seems to be a certain standard that has to be met in order for an article to be accepted and published for the community, which I believe is a good thing for all the members. This ensures that the work is being accepted for a reason, and that the due diligence has been served to ensure that the work is consistent with the already accepted information in the community and is beneficial to the community moving forward. Here is a list of all of the references I used in this presentation, and I'd like to say thank you for listening and hope you can enjoy getting into the study of writing and rhetoric studies.